Welcome back to the Hard Truth Studios here on this Friday, brought to you by our good friends at the Hard Truth Distilling Company, located in Nashville, Indiana, the heart of beautiful Brown County. Make sure you stop by. What a great time of year it is to be there. Always good. But brought to you, also bringing Zach Osterman from the Indy Star joining us. And Zach, it's been a week that a lot of people can kind of take their breath, catch their breath rather, after Indiana football has just jetted out to this 6-0 start, shocking a lot of Hoosier fans and a lot of national pundits alike. But they get to take a break. Also, Nebraska on a bye week, which is a little unusual for both teams to have a bye week before they clash on the field. But that will be the case in a game that is sold out in Bloomington. So crowd is going to be there and happening for a noon game, and it should be an absolutely spectacular environment in Bloomington next Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be, and I don't get the sense, if you look at kind of the distribution of tickets, I think there are only a couple thousand left at the beginning of the week. I don't get the sense this is going to be a one that's moving hard because of Nebraska fans coming over. Obviously, Nebraska's excited and frankly, should be. I think Nebraska's looked good at times this season. I don't know if they've quite looked as good as Indiana, although I would point out they've probably played some slightly tougher competition. But I mean, if I look at, I've been citing the Indiana's sort of position in the FPI a lot in the last few weeks. I mean, Nebraska's currently basically right on the cut line between 7-5 and 8-4. They're top 40. They're 5-1. I forget what I think they, like Indiana, have we kind of talked about some of these scheduling dynamics in the preseason. Nebraska, like Indiana, frankly, have a more forgiving schedule early in the year. And like Indiana, it gets a lot more difficult in the second half. They've got to come to IU. Then they go to Ohio State. They get UCLA at home. Then they have actually, again, if I'm not – no, I think they have a bye week again the week earlier than Indiana does. But then they go to USC. They host Wisconsin. Then they end at Iowa. So, they've started 5-1. I think if you're a Nebraska fan, you'd probably trade in for 3-3 over those last 6 here. So it's not a dissimilar dynamic to Indiana in the sense that you always knew that you needed to take advantage of the first half of the season to set yourself up, to maybe, more capitalize on opportunities than feel pressure in the second half. But they've done that. And I think this is going to be, at this point, I would be surprised if this is not the big noon kickoff game next Saturday. I would be surprised if it's College game day, given what the SEC slate has. But you're going to have a national TV audience. You're going to have a national show in town, and you're going to get a chance, if you're Indiana, to really put your best foot forward. I think in a way that if Indiana beats Nebraska, I think a lot of the complaints about Indiana's schedule thus far probably have to go away, and you have to start, reframing what Indiana is accomplishing here through sort of a different lens.
Yeah, because there are just too many metrics to look at. And I get that a lot of people can say, well, that's built on a house of cards, which I would disagree with. And I continue to point at Alabama going to Vanderbilt, and it can happen. You've got to be focused every week. As these guys talk about taking it one game at a time, there's a reason. You have to be focused on the immediate, the clear and present danger. Indiana, this one of the things that Kurt Signetti has talked about is handling success and just doing just what I just talked about. They've had 2 weeks off to get healed up, some nicks and whatever bumps and bruises they might have, but also to continue to work on the offense, which has been utterly efficient. Probably the most efficient in the league and one of in the country. But I agree with you. They beat Nebraska. Then the fact that Curtis Rourke, who leads the Big Ten in yardage and touchdowns, is just right now, he's the Big Ten MVP at this moment. And then those people I don't think they have a choice but to connect those two and say, okay, these are legit numbers, and it will continue. They'll get another opportunity behind Nebraska with Washington coming in. And then if they're able to get through those two and be at 8-0 with all else that they've accomplished, there's no doubt that everyone will just be forced to say, okay, we have to admit it. Indiana football is good. As hard as that is for any of us to say, facts are facts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. To be honest, listen, I know we can all get caught in the Twitter. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this show.
You can do whatever you like.
I don't think anyone who's remotely serious has been kind of spouting that bullshit. And when I say that, what I mean is, I think people who pump the brakes have been, with reason, have been pumping it on things like the playoff and like, okay, slow down. 6-0 is a nice start, but you are going to have to not least simply because you're going to need a better resume. You're going to have to beat some better teams. You're going to have to beat some better teams to prove you're at that level. You're also going to have to beat some better teams because, frankly, if the season ended today, Indiana doesn't have a resume for the playoffs just because they haven't beaten anybody. They've beaten maybe one bowl team. Again, let's, you go back to the FPI numbers. They think Maryland's probably a 6-6 team. That's probably the only bowl team Indiana's played to this point. Now, they've won all their games. No one's taking that away from them. But the point is, you've got to beat better teams, not just for the purpose of, quote unquote, proving it, but also because you're just going to need better resume wins. But I don't think anybody serious has looked at what Indiana's done through these first 6 games and in any genuine way suggested that it's not real, that like somehow, that it's a mirage. If you look at the advanced metrics, again, you look at S&P Plus, you look at FPI. I think there were some good numbers running around on Twitter yesterday about expected points added per play, the offense in particular, the defense. Actually, if you look at the analytics numbers, Indiana's defense, maybe unsurprisingly, has been a little bit more middle of the pack than Indiana's offense. I don't think that's a surprise. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. I think Indiana's defense has been good, but it's Indiana's offense that has just been outstanding. Indiana has the best offense in the Big Ten. If you look at the raw numbers, they have the second, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the best passing offense in the Big Ten. They have the best total offense in the Big Ten. That's yards per game. They have the best scoring offense in the Big Ten. If you even want to look at something like rushing, if you pulled together, if you basically made all 4 of Indiana's running backs into one running back, they would lead the Big Ten in rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. It is almost, it is just a statistical reality that Indiana is almost certainly the best red zone offense in the country this season. They have been remarkably efficient on third downs as well. This is the first time in program history they've scored 40-plus points in 5 straight games. They haven't trailed for a snap yet this year. I don't think anybody worth taking seriously, at least, is out there saying that Indiana is somehow, I don't know what the word would be like fraudulent for its 6-0 start. But what I do think, and this is where, I've gotten questions, for example, about is Curtis Rourke in the Heisman conversation. What I do think is this all speaks to something we all kind of need to adjust to, which is when you start 6-0, the way that Indiana has started, the way it's won these games, we begin to reframe the conversation. And it's no longer how good is Indiana relative to expectations or how good is Indiana compared to its historical norms. We start to reframe it around how good is Indiana compared to the best teams in the country and how good are its players compared to the best players in the country. And if you get into that conversation, that's when I think it's fair to say, okay, but you need to beat some teams that are likely to finish with winning records. You need to maybe go on the road and get a result at a Michigan State What do you do when Michigan comes to town? And on and on. You pointed out that Washington game is looking, kind of tasty. And Washington's in the midst of Washington is in the midst of a fairly difficult stretch too. They have Iowa on the road tomorrow. Then they have a bye week before they come in here. It's possible. I would guess they'll lose that game, but it's possible Iowa comes in here 5-2, and Indiana at worst is 6-1. And then you have another one of these games that is that a 3:30 CBS game? Is that a sad? Because I'm imagining it's not going to be a noon game with Washington coming east. Is that a Saturday night game on NBC? Another national audience? The point is, really, I think what reasonable people are saying is if we're reframing, because Indiana's earned the right to have its sort of narrative reframed, if we're reframing the narrative around Indiana, then we are going to have to raise the bar and say, well, if you're 6-0, no one cares about bowl eligibility anymore. No one cares about, hey, can Kurt Cignetti keep his string of winning seasons? Can he get it to 14? Now it's, how high can you climb? Can you get to 9 and match the single season wins record in program history? Can you get to 10 and break it? Can you get to 11 and get to a playoff? Can you win, maybe all but one of your remaining games and put yourself in the conversation to go to the Big Ten championship game? This is where I think people have started to say, not necessarily that Indiana's been fraudulent to start the season, but more just that as good as it's been, now you got to see them do it against better teams to believe that it's something that can sustain at a higher level.
Without question. And speaking earlier with Todd Leary, I talked about every game, at least in my opinion, every game on the schedule from here out, well, actually, since the Maryland game, gets harder every week. After Maryland, you went on the road. So that's just adds more difficulty. And we saw that. Now you come back and play the best team that they've played up to this point in the season so far. Well, that happens again after that when they play Washington. Then they go to Michigan State, and although Michigan State is not the level of teams that Nebraska and Washington are, it's at Washington State in East Lansing where 80,000 people wait for you. That's an unbelievable tough environment. Then you come back to play a tough Michigan team. Then you have to go to Ohio State, and you end with a rivalry game against Purdue, which may or may not be the easiest game out of those 6. Who knows? But they will have all the testing needed going forward. And but it is crazy to look and not look at a schedule and think that, okay, these 4 games are losses. And that's just not the case to think that they're in every game. And even with Ohio State, we've all considered that a probable loss all season. But I'll tell you more how I feel about that after this weekend when I see them play Oregon, because neither of those teams have actually played anybody either that I remember without going back to look at the schedule.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair to a certain extent. Nebraska's obviously played Illinois at home. Now they lost that game, so you only get so much credit for playing a tougher schedule when you lose against that schedule. I think Nebraska probably deserves some credit for playing, beating Rutgers last week. I think Rutgers is another team that's probably going to be in or around kind of the bowl conversation. Again, I'm referring back, and I don't mean to use this as just a cheat sheet. The FBI projections right now have them trending toward 8-4. But I mean, it's not completely unfair, to sort of point out, like, for example, until Washington beat Michigan, they hadn't really beaten anybody meaningful this season. I saw somebody mention, no, Ohio State's not played the most difficult schedule. And here's the thing. And I think this is where, number one, this stuff's always going to be fodder for debates and Twitter arguments and things. And that's just part of it. Like that's part of what fans get to do when you're having a really good season and you get to be excited. You get to argue about who's best on Twitter or on message boards. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like I get into it when I, with soccer, like, believe me, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it is, again, kind of reflective of this same idea I keep coming back to, which is when you win more, you have, and there's more at stake, you have and suddenly expectations and opportunities both climb, then you insert yourself into conversations you aren't used to being a part of. And I'm not trying to damn Indiana football with faint praise. I just, like, we've both been around this program long enough to know you didn't used to need to get on Twitter and yell about how Ohio State hasn't played anybody either. You know what I mean? Because Indiana was 3-3 and Ohio State was 5-0, and they were not the same. It's different when you win, and this is what's different. There's I'm gonna use it, I think, for something I'm writing next week. But there's a famous quote that is attributed to Greg LeMond, who was the first American to win the Tour de France back in the 80s. And somebody asked him if at some point cycling got easier for him, as he got better at it, if it ever just got easier for him. And he said, it doesn't get easier, you just go faster. Like, that is kind of the way college football works. If you win more, it doesn't get easier. You don't start getting things handed to you. The road isn't suddenly paved more smoothly or evenly. It actually gets harder because suddenly it's not just like, hey, 7-5 will be a nice season. But what can you achieve? How high can you climb? Just how high is your star going to soar this year? The flip side is, I've thought about this too. I think back to that 2012 IU basketball season under Tom Crean when Indiana beat Kentucky and Ohio State, and kind of came out of nowhere. They were a 5 seed. They got to the Sweet 16, etc. That season was just like, from the day they beat Kentucky, that season was just kind of like, just sort of like a never-ending march of joy. Because once they beat Kentucky, and certainly once they beat Ohio State, all the questions about, is Indiana for real? Is Indiana going to the tournament? Is Indiana on the bubble? Whatever. It all went away. And yet at the same time, it was kind of too early for it to be replaced with expectation around, okay, but you better win the league. You better not waste this, because everyone can kind of look out ahead and say this team's best days are ahead of it. Now, this football team is a little different. But my point is, like, you don't get seasons like this a lot where a team achieves so far out ahead of initial expectation that, like, this just gets to kind of be all fun. Like, if Indiana goes 3-3 from here, that's still one of the 3 best seasons in program history. If they win their bowl game, it's the best season in program history. Like, we're sitting here and we're kind of talking about, like, and I understand, and Indiana's earned the right to be in these conversations about the playoff, about strength of schedule, about who's played and when who's played and whatever else. But the other part of it is, like, there's a part of you that just sort of says, like, enjoy it, because the thing is, if Indiana comes back and does it again next year, and I'm not talking, I know nobody's thinking too far out in the future, but let's live in a world where Indiana comes back and does it again next year. Well, it's not all going to feel new and wonderful. It's suddenly going to be like, okay, but we expected that now, so it's a little bit less fun and it's a little bit more stressful, right? Whereas this year, it's like, if you're an Indiana football fan, this is just fun. Like, this is just gravy. And you just kind of get to take the pressure off and just see how high your team can climb. Like I said, it doesn't get easier. You just go faster. And the question is how fast Indiana can go. And I think, these next 2 games, Nebraska, certainly. Washington, I think Nebraska is a little better than Washington. Particularly, I think Nebraska is better defensively. And I think actually Nebraska is probably the best defense Indiana's played to this point. These 2 games, to me, really frame what to expect from that last month of the season. Can Indiana genuinely beat Michigan? Can Indiana go on the road to Ohio State and compete? Can Indiana get to 10 wins in the regular season? I think if they win these 2 games, the answer is yes. Because I think this is when you're starting to punch your way through the upper middle half of the Big Ten. And you're starting to kind of raise yourself above the teams that are even going to go, 8-4, 7-5, maybe 9-3. You're pushing them beneath you, and you're saying, and I'm rambling, forgive me, but obviously we've all had the bye week to think about this a lot. You're pushing them beneath you, and you're saying, we're going a level above. This is where I think Indiana proves that, is these next 2 weeks.
Absolutely. And I think that they've been looking forward to that, to be able, the team, the coaching staff, they're looking forward to having that feather in their cap. And I think if they are able to defeat Nebraska, that really will propel them with even more confidence than they have built up through those first 6 games, because not that they have any doubt in themselves, but they will know that they have the proof, and will just play even further. And this talk about a Big Ten championship game or college football playoffs, as crazy as it would have sounded 6 weeks ago, it is very real. And the Big Ten is going to play a big part in that. Ohio State is kind of the linchpin in everything here, because they play Oregon this weekend. Indiana does not play Oregon. Ohio State plays Penn State. Indiana does not play Penn State. But Indiana does play Ohio State. So Ohio State is going to have a big say in who joins if it's them. By the way, we're all assuming it's going to be Ohio State. They could lose to Oregon and somehow get upset by someone else. You never know. But we all expect Ohio State to be there.
It's different. Like I tried doing this after the Northwestern game, like briefly, like just looking at tiebreakers and things. And the problem is with the unbalanced schedule. Like if you look at it, Ohio State still plays Indiana, still plays Michigan, still plays Purdue, still plays Nebraska. Those are all common opponents with Indiana. Now, Oregon still plays Michigan, still plays Maryland, still plays Washington. But Ohio State doesn't play Maryland or Washington. But then I think Ohio State does play, or did play, Michigan State, who Oregon and Indiana both do play. So my point is, and then you can get in, we can dig through Penn State as well. It's basically just like way too early because like the tiebreakers are going to be so confusing. And I don't know if anybody read the tiebreaker email I did in the preseason. I did not expect it to be relevant to Indiana this year, but we are where we are. Like step 5 is to use some analytics company to basically break a tie. The company will say, we think that this team's better than that team. Step 6 is a coin toss. So, and I mean, it would be incredibly difficult to get there. But the point is, when you have such an unbalanced schedule, and this is going to be the same way for basketball, everybody needs to get ready for it. When you have such an unbalanced schedule, it is going to lead you to a place where it's going to be very hard to compare teams. And, the Big Ten and the SEC both have set up some pretty intensive, kind of tiebreakers to make sure they don't get to a place where they're going to this place, like I think it's called Sports Stats, and saying basically, can you separate these two teams for us so that we know which one to send to Indianapolis or Atlanta in the SEC's case? But basically, the short version of this is I tried to comb through some of these tiebreakers after the Northwestern game, and like there's too many data points that fit, comparing these 2 or 3 schools, but not this 4th school, or these 2 schools, but not these other 2 schools. I think we're probably going to be, because we're in a situation where ultimately you're trying to throw the whole, because this is the other thing people got to get used to. We don't have divisions anymore. So it's not even just like, well, just look at your division. You only have to worry about the other 2 teams in that. You have to throw the entire conference into one pot together and then separate them by tiebreakers. I don't think we're really going to be comfortably able to do that until probably week 10, if not week 11, before we can start gaming out scenarios that say, because this team beat these teams but lost to this team, and because this team beat these teams but lost to that team, then this will happen if this team does this and that team does that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. We'll certainly find out as we'll get back to action next week, a big weekend as Indiana has homecoming with the Nebraska game the night before that. Hoosier hysteria as the basketball season will also tip off. Zach Osterman from the Indy Star, I thank you, my friend.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me as always, Jim.
Appreciate you, sir.